2024 is going to be perhaps the most important year in crypto's history. Not only are we awaiting the Bitcoin halving, we are waiting for the approval of a spot Bitcoin ETF, which very well could be the greatest financial product to ever exist. All as we strive for regulatory clarity in the crypto industry. And that's going to completely depend on the next presidency. Recently, Vivek Ramaswamy spoke up about his 3 crypto rules he is looking to implement if he were to be elected. Also known as the 3 freedoms of crypto. This could be the best approach we have seen to crypto regulation. It's time to discover crypto. As you can see yesterday, Vivek Ramaswamy laid out his 3 freedoms of crypto policy framework. This is going to include number 1, protect code as freedom of speech. Number 2, self-hosted wallets shall not be impaired or limited. And number 3, the freedom to innovate shall be protected and regulations reduced. Here's what he had to say.
This new crypto framework is out. I got to ask you, if you become president of the United States, what changes from a crypto perspective?
I think what changes is that regulation by enforcement ends. What does that mean? That the rules are delineated clearly in advance rather than you having to wait for an enforcement action for the SEC to figure out whether or not a given coin was a security or not, that Gary Gensler refuses to say today, for example, about Ethereum. What also changes is that any unconstitutional regulation, not just as it affects crypto, this is part of a broader administrative state reform for me, but any regulation that Congress did not expressly give an agency the power to pass is null and void. It turns out that applies to most regulations governing the crypto industry. And I put these into 3 categories for the areas of reform that I've laid out. One is the freedom to code. It's my view that code is speech. And while it's perfectly appropriate for the government to go after bad actors, if you take the Tornado Cash example, going upstream for the actual developers of the code, that's wrong. You got to draw the distinction between the code itself, which is protected, versus people who misuse it to steal. That's something that's not happening today.
Over the years, especially since 2020 with the pandemic, we have seen a robust amount of censorship fled through our social media. Freedom of speech has continuously been centered and just used as a punching bag for our regulatory bodies. And we saw this most recently in the crypto sector, where Tornado Cash, the developers of Tornado Cash, were targeted by the United States government, simply for developing the code that was used by bad actors to money launder. It'd be like taking the Federal Reserve and throwing them all in prison because they're the ones that print the money, and letting the drug addict on the streets, who was actually spending the money for illicit activities, completely go free.
Freedom of speech is principle number 1. It's the freedom to code. Principle number 2 is financial self-reliance. I'll give you the punchline here. There's a lot that's behind it. I mean, the AML statutes, the Know Your Customer stuff, a lot of this, the Bank Secrecy Act, has been weaponized, but the punchline is self-hosted wallets should not be touched. I mean, that's part of the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian vision of financial self-reliance and independence. We can't have a regulatory apparatus that effectively creates self-hosted wallets and prevents them from actually being able to exist.
This is incredibly important with what we just saw take place with Ledger, where one of their latest updates allows governments to access users' seed phrases via a subpoena. And that was coming directly from the chief executive officer at Ledger. Vivek believes that the government should have absolutely no oversight against your keys and your crypto within your self-custody. It's the exact reason why Bitcoin was created, to destroy that middleman. We don't want the banks having control over our funds. Self-custody, complete self-sovereign custody.
So that's point number 2. And then point number 3 is just the freedom to innovate. And I say this as somebody who comes from multiple different regulated industries in the past. The wet blanket on American innovation isn't even Congress. It's the regulatory state that's making up its own rules, regardless of the laws that actually exist in this country. And so we'll rescind all of those unconstitutional federal regulations. We'll downsize the federal employee headcount by 75%, which I think is a good thing. A lot of these toxic regulation and enforcement action come from the fact that if you have a bunch of people showing up to work who shouldn't have had that job in the first place, they find things to do. We'll put an end to that. And the good news about all of this is these are things I can get done as the U.S. president without asking Congress for permission or for forgiveness, because this relates to the executive branch of the government.
And he's completely right. A lot of people don't know that Chairman Gary Gensler and these 3-letter agencies are actually appointed by the president himself. They aren't elected representatives from the people. They're not voted into power. and they are completely separate from Congress. So Vivek could easily come in and actually enforce that these regulators need to back down off their enforcement policies they have been using to approach crypto regulation. Now, while this is the best framework I have personally seen, we still need to be very cautious when approaching the regulation. Because if we do see the enforcement and see that stripped away from the SEC, and a lot of these cryptos immediately get handed over to the CFTC and labeled as commodities, this could just end up hurting investors even more. And the reason is I believe we need to see an entirely new committee set up for crypto. And Vivek believes so as well. For some context, is going to be what Gary Gensler said about Ethereum back in 2019.
Vitalik wanted to raise money. He was maybe 19 years old. He looped in with a venture capitalist from Canada, Joe Lubin, who now runs Consensus. Lubin took about 10% or 9.5% of the offering. They put 9.5% in a foundation called the Ethereum Foundation, and the other 80% was sold to the public for $18 million.
Gary Gensler just lied right there. You see, the reason why we shouldn't immediately classify Ethereum as a commodity, or even as a digital currency, and perhaps maybe it should be labeled a security, is because of the lie Gary Gensler just presented in this video. You see, the CEO of Consensus, Joseph Lubin, who he just said bought 10% of Ethereum's ICO, actually disagrees with this percentage, claiming he never owned more than 0.5% of Ethereum's supply. So if Joseph Lubin didn't fund Ethereum, who did? Well, I'll be dropping an entire video on something known as ETHGATE in just a week. So make sure you smash that like button and turn on those post notifications because you are not going to want to miss out on this. You see, a Chinese auto giant, Wanxiang Group, plans $50 million blockchain fund. This was from September 29th of 2015. And the managing director at Wanxiang owned subsidiary DataYes confirmed that the company had completed a purchase of 416,000 Ethereum, the native token on the Ethereum blockchain, in a total investment of $500,000. So again, Gary Gensler, who just told his class at MIT that they bought 9.5% of Ethereum and helped funded it, there's the proof that that was a complete lie, and very well could have been fabricated. You see, at the time that Gary Gensler was speaking at MIT, just a few months before, the Strategic Partner and Joint Development Agreement, which we can find on the SEC's website, shows that Shanghai Wanxiang Blockchain Inc. has partnered up with a company known as Prometheum. For you guys that don't know, Prometheum is the crypto industry's favorite punching bag, as shown by this CoinDesk article. And its founder is Aaron Kaplan, who claims that he was going to apply the federal securities laws in an extremely vague way, mind you, and launch an alternative trading system for crypto. That smug face just says it all. He's a punching bag for a very good reason. You see, there's not actually any regulatory clarity by the SEC. Gary Gensler was using Aaron and Prometheum as a way to enforce regulation and take control and power away from the CFTC, and is why today Republican lawmakers are demanding Gensler to tell them how Prometheum got SEC approval. Specifically Patrick McHenry, who's the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. Quoting, "The timing of the approval raises concerns that it was aimed at demonstrating that legislation is not needed because there is a workable regulatory framework for the custody of digital asset securities." Which again, there is no clarity, as we've seen in the Ripple lawsuit with the SEC. But it gets worse. You see, now that we know through the SEC filings that Vitalik Buterin with the Wanxiang Blockchain Labs, who he is, by the way, the chief scientist for, if you click on the English version of their website, you can simply scroll down and see that the chief scientist for this blockchain group is Vitalik Buterin. He helped found it. And even though Wanxiang Blockchain Labs is a nonprofit research institution, well, they go on to develop a $50 million fund known as Fimbushi, which I'll get to in just a second, and I promise you're gonna wanna stick around to see those cryptos. So Ethereum, founded by Vitalik, was invested into by Wanxiang Blockchain Labs, which is part owner in Prometheum Inc., which is giving regulatory favoritism by multiple financial regulators, also ends up partnering with MIT to develop a strategic cooperation. Again, right before Gary Gensler spoke at MIT to his students. So what does this prove? Well, it proves Vivek is right. The SEC should have no regulatory oversight over this industry, as there are multiple conflicts of interest. Not only is there regulatory favoritism, Gary Gensler, the chair of the SEC, has been getting his hands dirty with Ethereum for years. But this also proves that a lot of these altcoins, including Ethereum, maybe shouldn't fault to a commodity. Is it actually decentralized? Does proof of stake actually become more centralized over time? Is decentralization just a masquerade? This is why we need an entirely new committee that has no conflicts of interest, no lobbyists, no government oversight. A non-partisan committee that can come together and find the proper regulation for these retailers. Whether that's a safe harbor for 3 years of financial innovation, meaning a system has 3 years to become provenably decentralized at scale, to be considered maybe not a security. Because if we choose the wrong path and we regulate all of these cryptos as commodities, just like the Ethereum ICO might lean more towards a security, at least in its beginnings, a lot of these other cryptos pushed through Fenbushi Capital, which is the $50 million blockchain fund that was set up and has since received even more funding. Well, it can turn out that a lot of these other cryptos, whether it's BitDAO, VeChain, Maker, Graph, Flow, Stacks, you name it. And by the way, there's 13 pages of these cryptos. They're invested into almost every single major asset. It could very well turn out that we actually allow bad actors to operate in this industry and retailers to just simply be taken advantage more over time. So shout out to Vivek, because we need more industry thought leaders like this. Because it's obvious that current administrations have allowed things like the EPA or the SEC and even the CFTC to operate and enforce at their own will. And that's why we Bitcoin. Crypto is here to allow us to express the rights of freedom, individual sovereignty. It allows us to separate our money from state. And is why we know crypto is inevitable. And is how I know that I'm going to see you at the top of this next bull market.